Whoa. That looks just like a milkshake.
Yeah, that does look just like a milkshake.
Yum. Milkshakes are yummy.
Yes,
Milkshakes are yummy.
This is not yummy.
Ew. It's oil.
Last week, I posted this little clip on social media of my son and I working in the shop, and I asked if you wanted to see some sort of a quick and dirty video of me going through and troubleshooting this problem. Well, I'm happy to report we do fix the problem, and I discovered that I've made the biggest mistake that I've ever made building used axles. We've got a real mess on our hands in today's video. And this wasn't going to be a video, this is just some routine maintenance, but after showing some pictures on social media, a bunch of you said you wanted to see how I fix this. And so we're going to go through the whole process and figure out where we are leaking water into this housing. Every single oil change I've ever done on this axle, so about 12,000 miles is what I've got on the 1-ton swap. I've changed the rear oil like 3 or 4 times. Every single time it's a milkshake. So there's water getting in very, very easily, because some of those trips I didn't even go in water. It was just driving in the rain on the highway. So I want to start by saying we've got vents that are remotely mounted under the hood, and there's no way that water's like coming into the hood so much and then going underneath these vents. That's not a thing. And I just checked the front diff. There's 0 water in it. There hasn't been any time that I've changed the oil in that. But this is going to be a nightmare to clean. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to put everything back together. I'm going to figure out a way to pressurize the axle very lightly. We can't put too much pressure in this or we're going to start blowing out seals. And then we're going to see if we can hear air leak, and I could even start hosing things down. My theory is that we've got, because I've seen a little bit of moisture on this side of the axle tube, my theory is that we either have a cracked center section or something happened maybe when I was heating this up to weld on it where it like lost the seal. I mean, there's no seal in there, it's just a press fit, but I think somehow oil might be escaping up here because I see moisture build up there when the axle gets really hot. When I've serviced this rear axle in the past, it did not have anything close to the amount of water it has now. It was just a little bit of milk in there. You could see that there was some like moisture that was on some of the metal parts on the inside, so I knew there was a little bit of water getting in, but this was nuts. There was a ton of water in this rear axle. And what's even weirder is that brake clean doesn't really seem to affect it. Like, you could hose it down to brake clean, it doesn't really thin it out like oil. And I do remember that the last time I changed the oil, I threw some Lucas in there. So I don't know if that Lucas oil stabilizer mixed with gear oil, mixed with, Canadian water from me going over a bunch of water crossings last year, made some sort of a crazy brake clean resistant slurry, but it sure seems to. I've come up with 3 ways that we could test this housing. One would be to just flex test it. I could use my forklift, because yesterday when I was at Chaotic Fab, we flexed it out, and then after a few minutes of it sitting like that, it started to pool oil out of the top of the housing somewhere, and it was like pouring out of the truss. So that's not good, but it makes it really messy to try to weld it, because we know there's a crack or something in the steel, so we have to weld it. So number 2 would be to smoke test it. I don't have smoke testing gear, but that would be something worth investing in the future. Number 3 is to just pressure test it. And this is not dangerous in the fact that you're going to blow the rear axle up, but it's dangerous in the fact that you can just blow all the seals out if you're not careful. So I am going to try and regulate the amount of air coming through it needs less than a PSI to show bubbles. So we're going to put tiny amounts of pressure in it, and section by section, we're going to cross them off the list. Right now, we know there's definitely a massive leak in the top of the housing, but while I'm at it, why don't we check the axle shafts? Let's make sure there's no bubbles coming up around those O-rings. Let's check our vent fitting. So because we're going to be using this is a device that I came up with to bench test air lockers. So this is the size of modern ARB air lockers. This is the size of the old ARB air lockers and the size of the Yukon air lockers. So I'm going to disconnect the copper tube that goes into the back of the bulkhead connector. We're going to plug this into the housing. We're going to pinch off our vent tube, and then I'm just going to add the tiniest amount of pressure, and I'll squirt and test section by section before we finally end at the top of the axle tube, and hopefully I can see and hopefully I can film exactly what's leaking. One really big benefit that this plan has going for it is that I can clamp off the vent tube and I can like really give everything a super good test. So even once we find where the leak is coming from, I want to make sure that there isn't another small leak from somewhere else and this isn't like a cumulative problem from a whole bunch of different places. So I'm squirting soapy water section by section, and I'm just putting a tiny bit of pressure and then going and looking for bubbles. Because if you've ever done this kind of technique on other things, you know that it produces a ton of bubbles with very, very little pressure. But pretty quickly, I discovered exactly where the leak was coming from, and it was massive. There was no small bubbles. It was just blowing tons and tons of air through a very obvious and very embarrassing mistake that I made. This is one of those things that's impossible to film, so bear with me. I broke out my camera. Like, looks like the battery's dying on me. This is like I've had this for like 13 or 14 years. This is one of like the original inspection cams. So the screen is crap, but I was able to spot a hole, a tiny hole right down on the very corner of the truss, which what a terrible spot to have a hole. I think the vent used to be here. I'm pretty sure it was right here. I welded it up. I don't know. I don't know what happened. I don't know if whenever I welded up the hole, I just didn't weld it enough because I was scared of getting a bunch of stuff in there. It's just been too long now. But in any case, there's a tiny hole there, but it's big enough that air can get through it very easily. And because it's in this rear corner, I bet that water and everything just goes right to the corner and gets right into our housing. Everything else passed. So everything that I used the soap and water on, 0 bubbles out of it. So I think that everything else is sealing good, but clearly this big hole right here is a problem. And there's some mud and some different stuff that's in there from all the trips. So now what I'm thinking is I'm gonna have to figure out a way to clean that out really, really well, and then try to maybe feed a welder. I might do a welding rod and just try to just fill that whole corner with weld, and then we can use this to test it again. Let me know how you would have cleaned this spot. What I came up with is duct taping a little bit of 1/2-inch PEX pipe into the end of my shop vac, and then that gave me like a small vacuum that I could then like suck soapy water back out. You don't want to use brake clean. For those of you that don't know, you can't just brake clean a spot like this and then weld over it. It's super dangerous, and it creates a gas that can put you in the hospital. It's bad. So the best I could come up with is some soap and water, and then suck it out with a vacuum, soap and water, suck it out with a vacuum, and then I used an air nozzle and blew it out like 3 or 4 times to make sure all the soap and water and everything evaporated out. And then I really wanted to use a stick welder because the welding rod that I have would be pretty good for like a dirty weld like this, something that might have a little bit of paint on it, maybe even some of the soap and water residue. But I just could not, without being able to see it, I could not get the stick to work the way I wanted to. I'm not good enough at stick welding that I could do it completely blind. However, I am good enough with a MIG welder that I can do it completely blind. So I pushed the nozzle all the way in until it touched right where the hole was, and then I pulled back like, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch or so, and then just turned the machine all the way up and just laid on a super fat pass and just went back and forth and back and forth and up and down and made sure that I fully encompassed where the leak was coming from and gave it a super thick amount of weld to keep it from leaking in the future. Totally fixed it. I have no idea what the weld looks like. I'm sure it's beautiful since I couldn't see it. But I feel zero air coming out of here, and I can hear all the air escaping out of the vent under the hood. I figured out exactly what I did, but I do need your help. I'm curious on how you think I should move forward with this. I'm looking for an emulsifier. We'll get to that in just a second. So I'm hoping you can learn from my mistakes. I could just sweep this under the rug and not make a video about it, but I do want to help keep you guys from making the same mistakes that I do. And this is one that I can't believe I did. I think what happened is the vertical part of the truss went right over that vent hole that was right there. And because with a mirror, I could just barely see like a tiny circle on the inside of that truss. And so like this would be the inside that we welded. We stuck our nozzle through and welded the inside. And this is what I welded whenever I first did the truss. What I'm surprised about is that normally I would plug weld any holes, grind them smooth while I'm prepping for the truss. But clearly I didn't, because there was like a very circular hole on the back side. Like it wasn't a pinhole. Like you could see like a crescent moon kind of thing poking out. It was very small, but it was definitely enough for water to get in there. So now here's where I need your help. I'm looking for an emulsifier that you could possibly put in engine oil or in like gear oil. Because what an emulsifier is, for those of you who don't know, oil and water don't mix very well. But if you use an emulsifier, use something that maybe like alcohol-based, alcohol can mix with water, okay, and it can mix with oil, okay. And so often you can use an emulsifier like additive, and it'll make it all blend together. And then whenever you drain your oil, it pulls all water and contaminants and stuff out. And then when you change your oil, theoretically starting with much cleaner oil. I would like to do the same thing in the rear axle. Ideally, I should pull all the bearings and everything out and clean them. But I think, considering that it has so many miles on watery oil, I'm not concerned, and there's zero damage. I don't feel any play in any hub or anything. I feel pretty confident that I can just fill it with oil, run it through like a bunch of hot and cold cycles, you know, put like 300 or 400 miles on it, drain it again, and I should be good to go. But if you could suggest an emulsifier that you think will work back there, that will give me even more confidence that I could just put some oil in it, put an emulsifier in it. That'll help pull any existing watery contaminants out. And then whenever I change the oil, theoretically good to go. So this is an embarrassing one, and I shouldn't have taken 12,000 miles to get to it, but sometimes you prioritize projects, and that's exactly what happened here. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm a little embarrassed on this one, but you said you wanted to see it, so here it is. We'll see you on the next one.